Economic growth is one of the most important factors influencing the wealth of nations. We will see why in this lecture and discuss the factors that lead to economic growth. A remarkable example of economic growth has occurred in China over the last 30 years. In 1981, this major street in Beijing was filled with bicycles and pedestrians, with just a sprinkling of cars driven by the privileged few, and mostly small buildings dotting the street. 30 years later, the effects of tremendous economic growth has turned that same street in Beijing into a traffic jam of cars with huge skyscrapers towering above. The pedestrians have largely moved underground using one of the newest and largest subway systems in the world. How did this transformation happen so fast? China, along with many other countries, experienced rapid economic growth as a result of policies geared toward promoting growth. And although economic growth rates in the United States and in most European countries have not been as dramatic, these countries have enjoyed steady average growth for over a century, which explains why these countries enjoy the highest standards of living in the world. Economic growth is typically measured by real GDP growth, or the ability of a country to increase the value of its production of goods and services after removing the effects of inflation. Why is economic growth so important for a country? First, it generally leads to a better standard of living for its citizens. Although income inequality exists, economic growth in a country typically benefits everyone, including the poorest citizens. Second, economic growth leads to better health and longer life expectancies because countries can invest in better healthcare services, offer safer working conditions, and spend more on ensuring a clean environment. And third, economic growth allows countries to reinvest money into education, capital, technology, and infrastructure that promotes future growth. Interestingly, for much of human history, there were virtually no differences in wealth between countries, as this graph shows. Only since the mid-1800s with the Industrial Revolution did some countries begin to grow faster than others. And variations in economic growth have continued since then, creating rich countries and poor countries that we have today. Do rich countries really have much higher growth rates than poor countries? Not necessarily, because small differences in economic growth can result in large differences in wealth over time. This is due to the power of compounding, which occurs when increases in wealth build upon existing wealth over time. For example, a 1% difference in the average annual growth rate over 100 years can result in one country being 3 times richer than another, similar to the difference in the per capita income between the United States and Mexico. The disparity of wealth between these two countries was not caused by a dramatic difference in economic growth, but rather a small difference in growth that compounded over time. An easy way to measure the effects of compounding growth is to use a technique called the Rule of 70. The Rule of 70 estimates the number of years it takes for a value to double, given a consistent growth rate and the power of compounding. To use the Rule of 70, we divide 70 by the average annual growth rate, and the result is the number of years it takes for a value to double. For example, suppose your investment account averages a 10% annual gain. This means that your account will double in value in 7 years. If your account averages a 5% annual gain instead, it will take twice as long, or 14 years, before you see the value of your account doubled. Let's apply this technique to some real data. Over the past century, economic growth in the United States averaged 3% per year. If this growth rate continued, how long would it take before the size of the economy doubles? It would take 70 divided by 3, or 23 years. Because US GDP is about $16 trillion, a 3% growth rate will double US GDP to $32 trillion in 23 years. China's GDP is about $8 trillion, or about half the size of US GDP. However, China's growth rate over the past 20 years has averaged about 9%. At this growth rate, it takes China's economy just about 8 years to double in size, much faster than the 23 years it would take the United States. This is a staggering result given just a 6% difference in the average growth, and is one reason why China's GDP may surpass the United States in the next 30 years. However, as countries grow in size, it becomes more difficult to maintain high rates of economic growth. First, there will be the natural ups and downs in economic growth due to the business cycle, a series of recessions and recoveries, which sometimes looks like a roller coaster. Secondly, developing countries can often achieve high rates of growth because existing technologies allow them to modernize quickly, increasing productivity at a faster rate compared to developed countries, which must create new technologies to continue to grow their already advanced economies. This phenomenon is referred to as the catch-up effect. The catch-up effect explains why the fastest growing countries in the world today do not include the United States, Japan, or major economies in Europe, but instead are emerging economies in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and developing countries such as Vietnam and Ethiopia. However, once countries become wealthier, such as the Czech Republic or South Korea, continuing to grow requires more innovation to create valuable products and services that will allow them to continue achieving high growth rates in the future. Now that we have described the importance of economic growth, how is economic growth achieved? To answer this question, we need to focus on the 4 factors of production, which are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. These factors of production help countries increase productivity, which leads to economic growth. Let's conclude this lecture by summarizing the factors that will lead to higher economic growth. First, land is an important factor that includes both physical land as well as the natural resources that comes from the land, such as oil and coal. For example, many countries in Africa have discovered large deposits of oil, which has allowed them to achieve high growth rates. Second, the size and the quality of the labor force contributes to economic growth. The quality of labor, which is referred to as human capital, can be improved with greater education and job training. Third, the capital to labor ratio contributes to economic growth. Workers are more productive when they have more capital equipment to work with. This farmer in Bhutan in the Himalayas uses yaks to plow his fields, while this farmer in Iowa uses a massive tractor to do the same, a much more productive farming technique. And lastly, the improvement of technology and ideas, or entrepreneurship, will lead countries to develop new products that improve the lives of many people. Today's important innovations focus on renewable energy, telecommunications, and healthcare advancements. Let's summarize economic growth. Economic growth is measured by the improvement in a country's real GDP and generally leads to a better standard of living, health, and prospects for future growth. The power of compounding allows small differences in growth to result in large differences in wealth over time, which we showed using the rule of 70. Finally, the factors that lead to economic growth include access to greater land and natural resources, improved quality of labor, more capital, and greater technology and ideas.